Selfless people of sweat, tears, and laughter of friars, missionaries, and knights, nobles of the evangelizing conquest and the bandit loot. Spain offers in the 20th century a unique political phenomenon that to this day continues to arouse heated clashes among Spaniards. Francisco Franco accompanies atop the most condemned or simplified figures by the Manichaeism of contemporary historiography. War hero in Africa as the youngest general in Europe, a criminal coup leader for the left in the Civil War, harassed by Soviets and Anglo-Saxons, Franco was the undisputed leader of all of Spain. As leader of one of the longest and most stable governments in the history of a nation of exalted, noble, and violent traditions, why do we say that he was a unique political phenomenon? Join us until the end of this documentary. Francisco Franco Obama was born in the north of Spain, in the coastal village of Ferrol, in the region of Galicia. He was born in the year 1892. During his childhood, the Spanish Empire suffers three major wounds: the loss of the last territorial treasures under its command, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Born to a noble Galician family, his father was a strict Navy official, and his mother, a generous wife, very Catholic, noted for her female delicacy. He was called Paquito because of his small, thin stature. From a young age, the image of the gallant, quixotic Spanish knight and warrior paced through Franco's mind, with a certain romance for lost causes. Paquito wanted to continue the family line of naval servicemen, but the Spanish Navy suspended new admissions due to the damages suffered, now also in the war against the United States. So Franco turns his eyes inland and enters the Infantry Academy of Toledo. On the 13th of October 1907, at the age of 15, he takes an oath of allegiance to the homeland as a new Spanish soldier, a showcase of his character from childhood. In one of the typical hazing rituals that the veterans performed on the newcomers, Franco hit one of the old jokers on the head with a candlestick. Now, what was the national reality in which the young Franco was growing up, without which his figure cannot be understood? Spain, land of warriors and priests, of the cross and the sword he boasted, honored for the achievement of having evangelized half of the world and having raised the greatest empire. Where the sun never set from the 19th century lived one of the most convoluted political situations. The empire was disintegrating into its overseas territories. The principles of the French Revolution were being felt, and the Cadiz Constitution in 1812 paves the way for the transition from traditional monarchy to a constitutional monarchy with separation of powers, of liberal inspiration. Both visions, monarchists and liberals, would fight each other with little rest throughout the century in Spain. In turn, the wars between Americans and peninsulars in the New World ended up radically decimating the Hispanic political body. While in Spain, a dynastic war for the throne broke out in 1833 between the defenders of the late Fernando VII's daughter as legitimate successor and the defenders of Carlos Maria Isidro, his brother, as the legitimate heir to the throne. From this struggle would emerge Carlism, a traditionalist movement of great importance in Franco's era. Finally, the course in favor of Fernando's daughter triumphs, and Isabel II reigns Spain for 35 years. Until 1868, when she is overthrown and in Spain the Republic is inaugurated. But this trial of a federalist republic would only last 6 years. When in 1874 the monarchy returns to Spain with Alfonso XII and then with Alfonso XIII. However, this monarchy builds a liberal state model with universal suffrage, separation of powers and parties. The king was now more aesthetic than the actual sovereign who ruled. This monarchical stage will be known as the Restoration period, and this is the period in which Francisco Franco would be born. And it would last from 1874 to 1931, when the monarchy falls again and the Second Republic is established, but we will come back to this later. Returning to the year 1910, the young Franco graduated as second lieutenant, and in the region of North Africa, governed and populated by Spaniards, a rebellion had broken out. A very harsh war was being fought in that territory. Franco feels a call to combat and insists until he is sent to a regiment to fight in Morocco. On March 19, 1912, he experiences his baptism by fire, his first combat on African soil. In the following years, as the battle part said, he demonstrated, as the quotation said, incomparable courage, leadership skills, and energy deployed, almost always at the forefront of the advanced lines in arduous terrains, moreover against enemies more than fierce for their outstanding performances from camp to camp. A new name was starting to ring, the name of Franquito. Among the Moroccans, the comment began to circulate that the young officer had baraka, that is, special protection from the sky against bullets. Until the 29th of June, 1916, in the middle of a fierce combat, he receives a bullet in the belly. Almost everyone considered him dead, but after a few days he began to recover, and surprisingly it was said that the dead man had resurrected. He became a commander at 24 years old and was sent to the peninsula, to the Prince Regiment in Oviedo. There he resumes his desire for rigorous study, especially on political and economic topics. He also begins a romance, which turned into an official engagement, with Carmen Polo, a beautiful young woman from a distinguished Oviedo family. Although he showed no affinity for getting involved in politics, from then on he already displayed ideas aligned with political Catholicism, Spanish patriotism, and a certain monarchical traditionalism. Decades later, as head of state, Franco would write articles under the pseudonym Joaquin Burr, in which he severely denounced communism, Freemasonry, liberalism, and partisan parliamentarianism as the evils that had subjugated Spain. As head of state, Franco would also promote the doctrine of organic democracy against the artificial democracy of universal suffrage, the separation of powers and the parties which, in his opinion, had disaggregated the nation and did not represent the real common interest. The true democracy, according to him, was in the representation of individuals through their natural entities, that is, the family, the municipality, and the union or guild. In his government, these natural entities would appoint representatives to the Spanish courts, institution created by Francoism for the participation of the people in the tasks and decisions of the state. But we will return to the Francoist government later. Returning to his stay in Oviedo when he was just a commander, it was also there that his friendship with Millán Astray was born, who was realizing his dream of creating a new military force inspired by the famous Spanish Thirds. The call that Franco felt towards combat in Africa was combined with Millán Astray's offer to organize and command the first third of the Spanish Legion in Morocco. For his bravery, valor, intelligence, love for work, sense of sacrifice, and virtuous life. The Spanish Legion formed by Franco would be known for being the most ferocious and devastating, and for its spiritual vocation towards martyrdom. As Millán Astray said, the legionary spirit is of combat and death, of discipline and comradeship, of friendship, suffering, and toughness, of always going to the fire. The Spanish legionnaire loves danger and despises wealth. From 1921, there was no difficult war situation where the Legion did not intervene. Franco leads dozens of daring and effective operations and achieves the reconquest of Melilla when the region almost falls into enemy hands. His popularity had gained enormous fame in Spain as a war hero. He returns to the peninsula for a short rest, against the opposition of the high military command but at the king's insistence. Because of his youth, Franco was appointed lieutenant colonel and head of the Spanish Legion. At the age of 30, he had to return to Africa, where intense fighting was still taking place. And what about the wedding with his fiancée? Well, Franco said the wedding can wait, but the Legion cannot. At a sumptuous feast that they give him in Madrid before leaving for Africa, a priest very given to politics said, "I ask as a Galician to the government that if Franco finds a glorious death in Africa, his corpse be buried next to the tomb of the Apostle, Santiago in Compostela." In Africa, new victorious operations commanded by Franco, among them a historic 25 days walk to save the Spanish troops. They increased their national prestige. General Miguel Primo de Rivera takes power in Spain and has a dispute with Franco because he intended to withdraw the Spanish troops from Morocco. In what seemed like a confession of defeat, Franco convinces him of a risky but ambitious landing at the heart of the enemy. With this new operation led by Franco, Spain finally manages to pacify the Moroccan territory, and the Spaniards celebrate the long-awaited peace. But this would be nothing more than a pause for the storm that was about to hit the Iberian nation. On October 16th of 1923, Franco marries Carmen Polo. King Alfonso XIII is the wedding godfather and sends a representative to the wedding. In 1924, their only daughter would be born at 33 years old in 1926. Franco is promoted to general, the youngest general in Europe and recipient of 2 individual military medals. In the last 7 years, he had fought an average of 8 major battles per year. Unlike many military leaders of the 20th century, Franco had a long record of extraordinary field performances in battles with exceptional soldier and general attributes. To understand the civil war that was about to fall in Spain, it's necessary to contextualize that Spain at that time was ruled since 1923 under a monarchical military dictatorship, with Alfonso XIII as king and Captain General Miguel Primo de Rivera as the head of government. This regime came about as a result of a state of disorder in which Spain was in, alongside a dispute between liberals and monarchists of more than a century. The socialist, anarchist, and communist parties had also gained a lot of strength, further fueled by the fervor of the recent Bolshevik Russian Revolution. But the regime of Miguel Primo de Rivera falls, and with it the monarchy falls again. In 1931, the Second Republic is established in Spain. This democratic experiment was marked by high levels of conflict. The Spanish Socialist Workers' Party and the Communist Party, with their gangs of gunmen, openly proclaimed the dictatorship of the proletariat while fighting amongst themselves. The armed anarchists sought their social revolution as separatism was on the rise. On their side, there was a monarchical right and a republican right that faced the liberals. And in turn, the phalanx, contrary to the Carlists who aspired to restore the traditional monarchy. It had its own revolutionary, national, syndicalist, and patriotic vision, inspired by Italian fascism. Terrorist attacks, street clashes, revolutionary uprisings, and improvised alliances of dissimilar parties became regular. It was instability made into a republic. Let's go back to Franco a few years earlier at the establishment of the Second Republic in 1927. After pacifying Morocco, Franco was appointed as the director of the General Military Academy, which he was basically in charge of rebuilding from scratch. Almost 4 years later, on the 14th of April of 1931, the Second Republic is declared in Spain. Franco refuses to change the bicolor red and yellow flag for the new Republican tricolor flag until receiving a written order from the general captainship. Franco is seen as a threat, and 2 months later, the Spanish government, led by the socialist Manuel Azaña, suspends the functioning of the military academy. Franco says goodbye to his cadets in the courtyard of the academy without a flag, giving them an emotional speech considered a masterpiece of political and military oratory. He started by saying, "Gentlemen, cadets, I would like to celebrate this farewell act with the solemnity of previous years, when to the chords of the national anthem we would raise our flag one last time. And as yesterday you will kiss its rich taffeta, running through your bodies the shiver of emotion and your eyes clouding over at the spell of the glories embodied by it. But the lack of an official flag limits our celebration to these meaningful moments." In the coming years, Franco would hold various positions in which he would impress the Minister of War with his professional stature. In 1932, when a frustrated pro-monarchist military uprising occurs, President Manuel Azaña asks in alarm, "Where is Franco?" Milan Astray informs him that Franco will not get involved in national politics, except if communism reaches Spain. In the year 1934, Franco is appointed as the head of the Army of Africa. Also that year, a revolutionary strike is declared in Madrid and Asturias. Over 30,000 miners, many armed, revolt. Franco is the key man to suppress the rebellion at a high cost of deaths and suffering. After this revolutionary uprising that sought to install a new regime in the country, there seemed to be no turning back for a reconciled peace in Spain. The following year, Franco is appointed chief of the Central Staff. February 16, 1936, the Popular Front, which grouped the left wing of Spain, wins some contested elections. In a few days, Manuel Azaña is appointed as the government president. They dismiss the president of the republic and decide to distance Franco from the peninsula, sending him to the Canaries. The previously described political conflict only intensifies and exacerbates. Strikes proliferate, opposition parties are outlawed, leaders are imprisoned, and properties are confiscated. Catholics face strong persecution from both government and non-government entities. Just in that year, more than 400 religious buildings had been burnt or destroyed, in addition to violations and lynchings of parishioners. The radical wing of Largo Caballero, which openly proclaims the proletarian revolution, dominates the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, while encouraging left-wing paramilitary militias and seeking the support of the Soviet Union. Conspiracies had been brewing for years, also from monarchical groups, against the Republic, in which Franco had denied involvement. Because his personality was not inclined towards political intrigues, but on occasions he was invited to these meetings, which Franco listened to attentively. From the Canary Islands, he writes to the head of government, and the minister recommending that they meet with the high military commands and restore public order. He gets no response. This letter was considered as a last appeal from Franco to the government to normalize the situation within the law. The 13th of July. A gunman from the Socialist Party ends the life of José Calvo Sotelo, one of the most important leaders of the opposition to the Popular Front. With this news, Franco finally decides to join the military who were preparing the coup. He takes command of the African army, which was the most important of all, and declares a state of war from the Canary Islands. He distributes in his own handwriting the Manifesto of Las Palmas, a vital document of his life and philosophy, in which he announces, "How many of you felt holy love for Spain? How many of you pledged to defend it from enemies, even at the cost of your life? The nation calls you to its defense." Franco orders an assistant to tell his wife and daughter that he went out for a walk and he'll see them soon. And from there he heads to North Africa. The same Manuel Azaña, the socialist president of the Republic. He would say much later that Franco did not rise up against the Republic, but against the rabble that had taken over the Republic. On July 20th, Spain split into two factions. The Republican faction had greater manpower and resources. With them was the aviation, almost all of the navy and infantry, the assault guard, and the leftist political forces, anarchists, and unions. With the national faction was Franco's Spanish Legion, part of the Civil Guard, Navy, and Infantry, and the conservative, traditionalist, and Falangist political forces. A bloody civil war was beginning in Spain. Franco crosses from Africa to Cadiz with 2,500 soldiers in a few days. They take the city of Mérida and the city of Badajoz in hard battles, despite being outnumbered Franco. In Seville, on the 15th of August, the old red and golden flag is raised for the first time officially. The national forces in the Alcazar of Toledo had been exercising hard resistance for days, besieged by the Republican army. Franco commands a rescue mission. In a few days, the Nationals take the city. The Daily Express correspondent recounts those half-dead human specters, starving, left with nothing. They had not yet decided to leave their suffering. Then they saw Franco. Many did not know him, but upon hearing General Franco, those figures came back to life. It was the name for which they had resisted. They were giving cheers, crying, embracing the soldiers. It was the most dramatic moment I have ever experienced in my life. The nationalist uprising did not have a governing head. Different generals operated from different fronts, and it was necessary to establish a single command. After deliberations of the military high command of the insurgents, the Defense Board decreed in Burgos on September 29, 1936, appoint Francisco Franco as the Generalissimo of the national forces of land, sea, and air, and also as the head of the Spanish state and government. In Burgos, they were cheering for Franco for the first time as the leader of Spain. In this way, the offensive towards Madrid resumes, with fierce fighting on multiple fronts for several months. The Popular Front receives support from the Soviet Union and France, while Franco seeks support from Germany and Italy. At the same time, in April of 1937, the political unification of the Phalangists, Carlists, Traditionalists, and right-wingers is formalized in what was called the National Movement, which would serve as a sort of single party until its death. Franco thus manages to bring together contradictory political forces and to expel those who disagreed. He concentrated the military, executive, and political power in 1937. Unlike Bolshevism, which handed the state and society over to the party, Francoism submitted the parties to state sovereignty under his command. Madrid and other cities are filled with political police, private party prisons, and political courts. The persecution against the church intensifies. Both sides fight with courage and fierceness. Both armies display demonstrations of heroism and much cruelty. The battles continue, and Franco's troops conquer the north of Spain, the most important industrial area of the country. Likewise, many internal conflicts arise among the leaders of the Republican side. On July 1, 1937, the Spanish episcopate issued a pastoral letter to the world in which they characterized the effort led by the national side as a crusade. The Holy See recognizes the authorities of the national side as the official Spanish government. Portugal, Guatemala, Germany, Italy, and others follow them. After weeks of fighting in temperatures 10 degrees below zero, the Nationals recapture the city of Teruel, and the Republican army is decimated. In July, the last decisive battle would begin in the vicinity of the Ebro River. For 115 days, hundreds of planes, cannons, combat cars, and entire divisions fight all summer. In November, the Republicans are finally defeated. Following this victory, Franco launches the Catalonia campaign in December with over 300,000 men, January 26, 1939. The national troops have passed and conquered Barcelona. The President of the Republic, Manuel Azaña Diaz, leaves the country. Now France, England, Ireland, Switzerland, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and other countries recognize Franco's government. In March, in what was more a military march than an offensive, 500,000 men enter Madrid without firing a shot. Franco, with a cold in Burgos, receives Lieutenant Colonel Barroso, who gives him the news with tear-filled eyes. On April 1st, Franco drafts the historical war report. Today, with the Red Army captive and disarmed, the national troops have achieved their last military objectives. The war has ended. Shortly after, in May, the most triumphant parade Spain has seen in the 20th century takes place in Madrid. Franco, the next day, attends the Church of Santa Barbara and offers his victorious sword to Cardinal Isidro Goma y Tomas. While in the rest of Spain, parades celebrating peace were being held. But with the arrival of military peace, one of the most surprisingly complex political scenarios was about to begin in Spain, both domestically and internationally. With the war over, this is how the Franco regime begins in Spain, with unique qualities in the 20th century described by the leader himself. The three pillars of the regime were the army, the church, and the movement, and the three pillars of the movement were the family, the municipality, and the union. And who guided his politics with his words? Well, divine providence. Francoism was the synthesis of Catholic conservatives, Phalangists, and Carlists who grouped around the leader, and whose presence in the government varied at different stages of it. Franco's regime was not static, but adopted or discarded the best and feasible from these three currents, depending on the internal or external circumstances of each period. Different from each other, these currents were united by nationalism, attachment to Spanish tradition, and rejection of communism, parliamentarism, and liberal individualism. From almost a century of agitation in which Spain, no ruler governed without convulsions, with Franco more than 30 years of peace ensued. He was a cold, patient, pragmatic statesman with an austere lifestyle. Relentless in war, hard on dissidents in his early years of government, and numerous times merciful against his enemies when there was peace. The Civil War ended in 1939 and the first peace government was formed on August 9th, faced with a frankly Dantesque picture. A ruined economy, hundreds of thousands of great Spaniards dead, and a social fabric filled with distrust and resentment. And if that weren't enough, less than a month later, the Second World War breaks out, the worst news for reconstruction efforts. Franco, who had received aid from Germany and Italy, declares the country's neutrality and then non-belligerency. In October 1940, he meets Hitler in Hendaye. He disapproves of many requests made by the German chancellor. First was the Spanish situation. Hitler later said he wouldn't tolerate meeting with Franco again. In February of 1941, he meets with Mussolini. Franco's impression was that Italy would be defeated. There was a significant sector within the national movement calling for Spain to join the Nazis and fascists in the war, but Franco refused. Spain was a refuge for both fleeing Jews and important exiled nationalist figures like Otto Scorsese and Leon Degrelle. Early in the war, Franco formed an Iberian alliance with Portugal's ruler Salazar to strengthen non-belligerence. Both would continue to insist on a negotiated peace, without success. When Germany declares war on Russia, the Blue Division is formed in Spain, in which over 30,000 Spaniards bravely fight against the Soviet offensive. Franco also feared an invasion by the Allies. As a result, he performs a first internal purge in the government and in the movement, sidelining Phalangists who were very much in favor of supporting Germany. With this, the Catholic and monarchist right wing begins to gain more ground in Francoism. In 1942, the creation of the Spanish courts is enacted. These represent the organic democracy described previously. It wasn't a liberal parliament, but rather the organ of public participation through its natural institutions, where laws could also be developed or consulted. The courts reduced the importance of the so-called National Council of the Movement, a sort of Politburo of the Francoist Party. In this way, Francoism moved away from the totalitarian model of National Socialist fascism, where the party leadership basically determined everything. In 1942, the Americans landed in North Africa, and Franco receives a letter in which President Roosevelt clarifies that Spain has nothing to fear. Meanwhile, the German chancellor rejects the German proposal to invade Spain in 1943, arguing that the Spaniards were the only tough Latin people, and this would lead to a draining guerrilla war. Meanwhile, the Spanish people are enduring significant economic and social difficulties. When the victory of the Allies seemed to be already a fact in 1943, Spain starts to approach the Allies. They withdraw the Blue Division from combat and adjust Spanish trade to the conditions imposed by Great Britain and the United States. Franco tries to warn the Anglo-Saxons that Soviet communism was a greater threat than the Germans, but the Anglo-Saxons ignore him. At the same time, Franco had to deal with internal monarchist groups who wanted him to hand over his position to Don Juan Borbón. Heir to the old overthrown monarchy, Franco had stated that his regime would lead to the restoration of the monarchy, but in his own way and at the right times. In 1945, the law of Spanish charters was approved, which established a series of rights, freedoms, and duties of the Spanish people. It differed from liberal constitutions in that it spoke of Spaniards and not citizens, and freedoms and rights were granted by the sovereign. That is, they had no rank higher than the decisions of the head of state and other laws that regulated them. Roosevelt in 1944. Referring to Spain, he says he sees no place in the United Nations for governments whose origins have fascist principles. Winston Churchill backs him. By May of 1945, they finally celebrate the end of the World War in Spain. But Spain would now have to face all sorts of new challenges. With the war over, the Soviets unleash an international campaign against the Franco regime. In turn, the United Nations passed a resolution declaring the exclusion of the Spanish government from international bodies. The withdrawal of ambassadors. and they threatened to take measures. If there was no change of government in the Iberian nation, Franco held a referendum in 1947 where the restoration of the monarchy was approved. But he was left for life with the leadership of the state, and he anticipated the modalities of succession. Faced with international isolation, Franco enters a tough diplomatic game and manages to win for the cause of Spain. To most Hispanic nations, to Arab countries, and to influential clans in the American financial and political world. He also aims to exploit the new Cold War plan, ultimately succeeding in having the UN sanctions lifted. And in 1953, he signs an agreement with the United States under which Americans will have military bases in Seville, Madrid, and Zaragoza. In exchange, the United States will grant economic loans and military aid to Spain. This also led to the Spanish decolonization of Morocco. Likewise, a concordat was signed with the Holy See in 1953 that consecrates the Franco regime in perfect collaboration between the church and the state. Does Spain achieve a long-desired international political stability, finally, not without making certain concessions of its sovereignty? At a cultural and religious level, a quality that characterized the Franco regime was the confessional state and national Catholicism. The Catholic religion is the official state religion and is promoted from power. The canonical marriage has civil value. Teaching in schools is adapted to Christian dogma and is delivered with strict hierarchical discipline. And in cinema, press, radio, and television, there was surveillance against materials that undermine Christian faith and morals or Spanish identity. The regime promoted the notion that Catholic faith was inherent to Spanish identity. However, Christian tradition and morals would begin to recede with the economic and cultural modernization that was about to be experienced, Spain slowly transitioning from national Catholicism to a more liberal and capitalist consumer society. On the other hand, from a 45% illiterate population, only 4% remained. In the 70s, the number of public libraries increased, and the world of publishing houses, books, magazines, and the rise of comics called TVOS also grew. There is also a denouncement of a cultural debacle in Franco's Spain. Although there were many intellectual and talented artist exiles who were more aligned to the left, weren't there also few writers, musicians, artists, and journalists left in the country who displayed all kinds of cultural expressions? On the other hand, while society and the government maintained a traditional view of the roles of men and women, the women's section of the national movement promoted greater participation of women in the cultural, educational, and professional life of Spain. More than 1 million women entered the workforce in the 60s. On the other hand, the Francoist economy is usually divided into two periods, one from 1939 to 1959, where an autarkic vision prevails, more concerned with internal industry and internal stabilization. This model was assumed when Spain came from 3 hard years of war and decades of instability, with a majority living under very precarious conditions. With rationing cards and Europe beginning a world war? In this autarkic period, the INI was founded, which promotes important iron, steel, and aluminum companies. The reservoirs and dams multiply, ambitious plans for agricultural colonization are carried out. And in the 50s, a policy of large power plants, Avale steelmaking, bituminous extraction, refineries, and shipyards is developed. In trade, a policy of controls for different types of changes is maintained and licenses to be able to import. During this time, a real social security is strengthened with a welfare state, and a whole range of labor laws considered favorable to the working class are approved. Although the economic base had been stabilized, the results were not at all optimistic. There was stagnation in a world that was turning to capitalist development, foreign trade was weak, and a significant black market persisted. All of this in a global geoeconomic context where the margin for action was really limited. The second economic period of Francoism occurs when it is decided to put an end to the vision of economic autarky. In 1959, stabilization plans are approved, and then development plans that would bring Spain greater commercial openness and openness to foreign investment. Monetary controls are lifted, and Spain joins global economic bodies such as the International Monetary Fund. This new openness plan boosts the industrial network and greatly expands tourism. Agriculture is modernized, national infrastructure is extensively developed, and millions of social housing units are built. This process was called the Spanish economic miracle. Almost no country had industrialized so quickly. Inflation is curbed, the middle class and per capita income grows substantially, unemployment hits historical lows, and Spain changes its facade. Pre-industrial. Spain in the 70s was the 9th industrial power in the world, and the debt was very low. Almost all of these indicators would worsen in the 30 years of democracy after Franco. But these international credits and foreign investments that Spain received during this period, as well as entry into the common European market, did not come without conditions. Was a change in political model demanded of Spain? By the lenders. Franco skillfully makes minor adjustments without significantly altering his political framework. In 1966, the prior censorship regime in force since the Civil War is repealed, and greater religious freedoms are also granted. Franco was also demanded to grant freedom to political parties and unions, but the regime refused. In turn, an organic law of the state is enacted as the 25 years of peace are celebrated. This law sought to give a more institutional base to his regime. This timid political and economic opening also brought new cultural influences to the population, and they are changing the mentality and culture of the Spaniards. On April 1st, 1959, the monumental work The Valley of the Fallen, with the world's largest cross, is inaugurated. Intended for reconciliation and to provide rest for the dead from both sides in the Civil War. That same year, an official visit from President Dwight Eisenhower was received. While maintaining a developmentalist and modernizing policy economically and socially, Franco's succession was a topic of discussion. There is talk of giving Spanish education to Prince Don Juan Carlos. This education progresses successfully, and European princesses begin to be considered as potential future wives for the prince. Finally, he gets engaged and marries Princess Doña Sofia of Greece. The expected is announced on July 22nd of 1969. Franco delivers a speech in the Cortes in which he proposes a law, in which Prince Don Juan Carlos de Bourbon and Bourbon will be his successor with the title of king. The prince swears, in the presence of Franco, on the Holy Gospels, loyalty to the head of state and fidelity to the principles of the national movement and other fundamental laws of the kingdom. But the story after his death would be another thing. At the same time, Prince Carlos Hugo de Bourbon, whom the Carlists considered the legitimate successor to the throne, is ordered to leave Spanish territory. Also in those days, the Matissa scandal broke out, implicating various former ministers of Franco for complicity in the diversion of billions of pesetas from the national treasury. Due to this, a major cabinet reshuffle occurs in 1969. There is also a great shock in 1970 when members of the separatist organization Basque Homeland and Liberty are arrested, some and 9 sentenced to death for various acts of violence. Many oppose, but also many express for the unity of Spain and adherence to the army. But Franco ends up commuting the sentences and no execution is carried out. In turn, new democratic organizations begin to proliferate illegally in the country, with the aim of establishing a new political regime. For its part, the economy and public works maintain their upward pace. The 8th of June, 1971, the head of state appoints Admiral Luis Carrero Blanco as prime minister. This is the first time that the caudillo separates the powers that until then had converged in his person as head of state and prime minister. That same year, the third development plan is approved. An American politician visits Spain and asks Franco what he thought about Spain's future. Franco responds that they were already in the future. For 1973, the regime signs new commercial collaboration agreements with the Soviet Union, Socialist Germany, and Socialist China, also showing a shift in its policy. But the inner turmoil persisted. On December the 20th of 1973, the president of the government, Carrero Blanco, is suddenly assassinated as he was leaving a church of San Francisco Javier, and an explosive charge reached his vehicle. Is Spain again shocked by the fear of the return of political violence to the country? From the beginning of 1975, there was an escalation of Basque separatist violence, with assassinations of several law enforcement officers and other private individuals. During the summer, the violence increases. The attacks, almost exclusively until then from the Basque country, also occur in other cities, Madrid, Barcelona, and Valencia. Basque Homeland and Liberty members and the Anti-Fascist Front are condemned for the deaths of civil guards and police officers. 4 of them are shot. After the sentence, an international campaign against the Franco regime is unleashed. Several countries temporarily withdraw their ambassadors from Madrid, and Spanish embassies abroad are attacked. Meanwhile, over 500,000 Spaniards gather in Plaza Oriente in Madrid to show their support for the Generalissimo and the government. Similar demonstrations occur in the country's major cities. Several attacks in the following days end the lives of 4 civil guards and 3 policemen. In this picture, General Franco begins to fall seriously ill. For several weeks, he fights for his health and is operated on several times. These are days of great anxiety and expectation for the Spaniards. Franco writes a will in which he says, "In the name of Christ I honor myself, and it has been my constant will to be a faithful son of the Church, in whose bosom I am going to die. I ask for forgiveness from everyone, as I wholeheartedly forgive all those who declared themselves my enemies, without me considering them as such." At 6 o'clock on November the 20th of 1975, National Radio of Spain, in connection with all the stations, communicates, "Attention, Spaniards, the Minister of Information and Tourism speaks. With profound sorrow and feeling, I read the following statement. As reported by the on-call doctors, His Excellency the Generalissimo has just died of cardiac arrest." The news spreads across Spain and globally. Millions of Spaniards express sadness while millions more rejoice. In the column room of the Royal Palace, in the burning chapel, a crowd goes to pay their respects to the caudillo of all Spain. While many celebrate his death as the end of one of the darkest periods in Spain, the Primate Cardinal Don Marcelo González Martín declares that no one will ever take away the state leader who has just died. The honor of occupying one of the most glorious pages in the annals of national history, the one he has written with his life and his death, is so sublime that it can continue to illuminate all Spaniards, as long as there is a single goodwill attitude. End quote. Nearly 5 decades post-Franco's death, modern Spain bears little resemblance to his era. So different that they seem like 2 unrelated worlds in 2 different eras and totally irreconcilable with each other. But as unlikely as it may seem, deep down, that's still the same Spain. The Spain of Don Quixote, the Spain of the convents, the Spain of the evangelizing deed that conquered half the world, the Spain of overwhelming passions and violence, the one that, with scorn or nostalgia, continues to hold the memory of Francisco Franco's Spain in its mind. A unique political phenomenon in the 20th century military, political head of state, with no one close to defeating him until his death. Today's Spain is still divided in his name.